she saw him drop it twice. The little model airplane slipped from his small fingers, clattering onto the marble floor of the most expensive ballroom in Manhattan. Not one person stopped to help. Picture this. Hundreds of millionaires in designer suits, sipping champagne that costs more than most people's rent. And they're all stepping around a 7-year-old boy like he's furniture. But here's what shocked everyone who was really paying attention. His father was Jason Carrington, worth $12 billion, standing just 20 feet away. Layla Martinez had been hired to photograph this charity gala. She'd shot events like this before, but something felt different tonight. Wrong even. While adjusting her camera lens, she watched the boy bend down to pick up his plane for the third time. His movements were careful, deliberate. He wasn't crying or throwing a tantrum like most kids would. He just existed in this sea of people who acted like he was invisible. The kid had dark hair that fell into his eyes and wore a tiny tuxedo that probably cost more than Layla's car payment. But money can't buy what every child needs most: attention from the people who matter. What would you do if you saw a child being ignored by an entire room? Most people tell themselves it's not their business. Layla almost did the same thing. Almost. She lowered her camera and really looked at him. That's when she noticed something the wealthy crowd had missed completely. The boy's hands weren't just fidgeting, they were moving in patterns. Quick, precise gestures that looked like sign language. Her heart stopped. Felix, she'd learn his name later, wasn't just being ignored. He was trying to communicate, and nobody could understand him. Worse than that, nobody was even trying to understand him. The airplane fell again, this time rolling under a woman's designer heel. She kicked aside without looking down, too busy laughing at whatever story was being told in her circle. Felix watched his toy disappear into the crowd, his shoulders sagging in defeat. But here's the part that made Layla's blood boil. Jason Carrington was right there. This man could buy entire companies with a phone call, owned 3 private jets, had his face on magazine covers worldwide. He was talking business with 2 other billionaires, gesturing with a crystal glass, completely oblivious to his son's silent struggle happening 15 feet away. How does a father with unlimited resources fail to see his own child drowning in plain sight? The answer to that question would change everything Layla thought she knew about wealth, family, and the price of success. Because what she discovered next wasn't just heartbreaking. It was unforgivable. Felix gave up on his airplane and walked to the massive windows overlooking Central Park. He pressed his small palm against the glass, staring out at the city lights. From Layla's angle, she could see his reflection. The loneliness in his eyes was so raw it made her chest tighten. She'd photographed hundreds of these events, seen wealthy families pose for pictures, all smiles and perfect positioning. But she'd never seen anything like this, a child invisible in his own world, surrounded by people who had everything except the ability to see him. The gala continued around Felix like he was a ghost. Waiters passed by with champagne. Women in glittering gowns swept past without a glance. Men in expensive suits discussed deals and vacations and stock prices, their voices echoing off the high ceilings. And through it all, this little boy stood alone at the window, his hands moving in silent words nobody bothered to learn. Layla made a decision that night that would expose a family secret so devastating, it would make headlines around the world. Because what she didn't know yet was that Felix's silence wasn't just about being deaf. It was about being forgotten. The question that kept haunting her, the one that would drive her to dig deeper into the Carrington family's perfect facade, was simple. How long can a child survive being invisible before something breaks forever? She was about to find out why a billionaire would choose his empire over his son. And the truth was darker than anyone expected. Layla put down her camera and walked across the ballroom floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. What was she doing? This wasn't her job. She was hired to take pictures, not rescue lonely kids from their own family parties. But something pulled her forward anyway. Felix was still standing at the window when she approached. Up close, She could see the details that the distant crowd had missed. The way his fingers traced patterns against the glass, the careful way he breathed, how his eyes tracked movement without turning his head. She'd learned basic sign language years ago, when her neighbor's daughter was born deaf. The skills were rusty, but the muscle memory was still there. Layla moved slowly into Felix's peripheral vision, then gently tapped her own chest. When he looked at her with startled dark eyes, she signed a simple message. "Hello. I'm Layla." The change in Felix's face was instant and heartbreaking. His eyes went wide, then filled with something Layla hadn't expected. Hope mixed with disbelief. Like he'd been waiting his entire life for someone to speak his language. He glanced around quickly, checking if anyone was watching, then signed back, "You can understand me?" His movements were fluid, natural. This wasn't a child struggling with a new language. This was someone who lived and breathed in sign language because it was his only real form of communication. "Yes," Layla signed, her heart breaking a little more. "How long has it been since someone talked to you like this?" Felix looked down at his polished shoes, then back up at her. His answer made her stomach drop. "A very long time." "How is that possible?" This kid lived in a mansion probably worth $50 million. His father could afford the best teachers, interpreters, specialists in the world. Yet here he was, starving for basic human connection. "What's your name?" she asked, even though she suspected she already knew. "Felix," he signed, then paused before adding something that made Layla's chest tighten. "But most people don't ask." She looked over at Jason Carrington, still deep in conversation with his business associates. The man was animated, laughing, completely engaged with adults who spoke his language, money. Meanwhile, his son was having his first real conversation in who knows how long. "Tell me about your airplane," Layla signed, nodding toward where it had disappeared under someone's foot. Felix's face lit up. Not just a smile, but pure joy that transformed his entire appearance. "I built it myself," he signed quickly, his hands moving with excitement. "It's a model of a Cessna 172. I want to be a pilot someday." The irony hit Layla like a punch. This kid dreamed of flying, of soaring above everything, while being trapped in a world of silence below. "That's amazing," she signed back. "Have you told your dad about wanting to fly?" The light in Felix's eyes dimmed immediately. His hands hesitated before responding. "He doesn't know how to talk to me." 6 words that explained everything. A billionaire who could negotiate million-dollar deals, who commanded boardrooms and built empires, couldn't have a simple conversation with his own son because he'd never bothered to learn his language. Felix glanced toward his father again, and Layla saw something that made her decision for her. The longing in this child's face wasn't just about wanting attention. It was about wanting love from the one person whose approval mattered most. "Would you like me to help you get your airplane back?" she signed. Felix nodded eagerly, but then his expression grew cautious. "Why are you being nice to me?" The question revealed everything wrong with this picture. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to wonder why an adult was showing him basic kindness. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Because Layla was about to discover that Felix's isolation wasn't an accident. It was a choice someone had made for him, and that someone was closer than anyone imagined. Across the ballroom, Jason Carrington froze mid-sentence. He'd been discussing a merger worth $200 million, but something pulled his attention away from the numbers. His son, the boy he barely knew how to reach, was animated in a way Jason hadn't seen in years. Felix was talking, not with his voice, obviously, but with his whole body. His hands moved rapidly, his face bright with excitement, his posture straighter than it had been all evening. And the woman crouched beside him was responding in the same silent language. Jason's business associates kept talking, but their voices faded into background noise. For the first time in months, maybe years, his son looked happy. The sight should have filled him with relief. Instead, it stirred something darker. Irritation mixed with what might have been jealousy. This stranger had accomplished in 5 minutes what Jason hadn't managed in 7 years. she'd made Felix smile. "Sir?" "The Singapore proposal," one of the men asked, clearly repeating himself. Jason waved him off, unable to look away from the scene by the window. The photographer, he remembered her now from the event coordinator's briefing, was showing Felix something on her camera. The boy leaned in close, pointing at the screen with genuine curiosity. When was the last time Felix had looked at Jason with that same interest? The answer was painful: never. Jason set down his champagne and took a step toward them, then stopped. What would he even say when he got there? He didn't know sign language, had never bothered to learn it, despite having the best tutor's money could buy on speed dial. The truth was more complicated than that, though. Learning sign language would mean admitting something Jason wasn't ready to face, that his son's deafness wasn't temporary, that it wasn't something money or specialists or wishful thinking could fix. For 3 years after the diagnosis, Jason had dragged Felix to doctor after doctor, searching for a miracle cure that didn't exist. Experimental treatments, second opinions, third opinions. He'd spent a fortune trying to make his son normal, instead of learning to love him exactly as he was. Felix glanced over and caught his father watching. The joy on the boy's face dimmed slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like guilt, as if being happy was somehow wrong. That look cut deeper than any business loss Jason had ever experienced. The photographer followed Felix's gaze and noticed Jason for the first time. She stood slowly, uncertainty flickering across her face. She probably expected him to be angry that she'd interrupted his son's solitude. But Jason wasn't angry. He was something worse. He was ashamed. Ashamed that a stranger could connect with his son when he couldn't. Ashamed that Felix looked more comfortable with someone he'd just met than with his own father. Ashamed that he'd built an empire but couldn't build a relationship with the person who mattered most. The question burning in Jason's chest was one that would haunt him long after this gala ended. How do you bridge a gap you've spent years widening? Felix was still watching him, those dark eyes searching his father's face for some sign of approval or disapproval. The boy's hands moved slightly, nervous, fidgeting that Jason now realized might be words he couldn't understand. Would he step forward and try to join their conversation? Or would he retreat back to the safety of business talk and spreadsheets? The choice he made in the next 30 seconds would determine whether this night marked the beginning of something new, or just another missed opportunity in a long line of failures. Jason took another step forward, then another. "Your airplane," Layla signed to Felix, pointing toward the crowd where his toy had disappeared. "Let's find it together." Felix's eyes darted to his father, now walking toward them with purpose. His hands moved quickly. "I should go back to my corner. He doesn't like when I talk to people." The sadness in that statement made Layla's heart ache. A child who'd been trained to make himself invisible at his own family's event. "You weren't bothering anyone," she signed back. "You were just being you." For a moment, Felix stood taller. Then Jason's voice cut through the ballroom chatter. "Felix, come here." Not a request, a command. Felix's shoulders sagged immediately. He started to step away from Layla, but then something unexpected happened. He looked back at her, then at his father, then made a decision that surprised everyone. He stayed put. "I want to find my airplane first," Felix signed to Layla, loud enough for his father to see even if Jason couldn't understand the words. Jason's jaw tightened. He'd been defied by business rivals, politicians, even board members, but never by his 7-year-old son. "Felix." Jason's voice carried the tone that made executives scramble and assistants take notes. "Now." But Felix had found something in Layla's presence that he'd never had before. Someone who saw him as more than a problem to be managed. Someone who spoke his language, literally and figuratively. He signed something to Layla that made her smile, then took her hand. The simple gesture sent shockwaves through the nearby guests. The Carrington boy, the quiet one who usually stood in corners, was holding hands with a hired photographer. Worse, he was ignoring his father's direct order. Jason's face flushed red. In a room full of people who measured worth by net worth and influence by Instagram followers, his authority was being challenged by a child who couldn't even speak. But here's what none of those wealthy spectators understood. Felix's defiance wasn't about rebellion. It was about hope. For the first time in his young life, someone had made him feel like his thoughts and dreams mattered. Have you ever been so starved for understanding that you'd risk everything just to hold on to it for a few more minutes? That's exactly what Felix was doing. Layla squeezed his hand gently and signed, "We'll find your airplane. But first, tell me more about flying." Felix's face lit up again, and in that moment, something shifted in the ballroom. The guests weren't just watching a child anymore. They were watching someone discover what it felt like to be seen. Stories like this remind us how powerful it is when someone simply notices you exist. When someone takes the time to learn your language, whether that's sign language or just the language of your heart. If you want to see more moments that change lives, subscribe now, because the world needs more people willing to see the invisible. But Jason was about to make a choice that would test just how far Felix's newfound courage could stretch. "What else do you love besides airplanes?" Layla signed, genuinely curious about this remarkable boy who'd been hiding in plain sight. Felix's hands moved with growing excitement. "I build cities. Tiny ones. In my room." Cities. Layla's eyebrows rose. "Like with buildings and roads?" "Everything," Felix signed rapidly. "Houses, shops, parks, even little people. I use cardboard and glue and paint. Sometimes I take parts from old electronics to make streetlights that really work." The complexity of what he was describing hit Layla like a wave. This wasn't finger painting or building blocks. This was engineering, architecture, urban planning. At 7 years old, "How big are these cities?" she asked. Felix spread his arms wide, then wider. "My whole room floor. I've been building it for 2 years. It has 3 neighborhoods and a downtown with skyscrapers." He paused, then added with pride, "The tallest one has 43 floors. Layla stared at him. She'd photographed art gallery openings, tech conferences, even NASA events. What Felix was describing would impress adults with advanced degrees. "Does your dad know about your cities?" The light in Felix's eyes dimmed. "He's never been to my room. Well, not to see my cities. Sometimes he comes in to say goodnight, but he doesn't look at what I'm building. I don't think he cares about kid stuff." Kid stuff. This child was creating complex urban environments with working electrical systems, and he thought it was just kid stuff because nobody had bothered to recognize his genius. "Show me pictures," Layla signed, then remembered where they were. "Do you have any with you?" Felix nodded enthusiastically and pulled out a small sketchbook from his jacket pocket. The pages were filled with detailed blueprints, building designs, and mathematical calculations that looked like they belonged in an architect's office. "This is my new project," he signed, opening to a page covered in precise drawings. "A bridge that connects the east side to downtown. I calculated the weight distribution and everything." Layla's jaw dropped. The sketches weren't childish doodles. They were technical drawings with measurements, angles, and engineering notes. Felix had been teaching himself concepts that most people didn't encounter until college. "Felix, these are incredible. You're not just building cities. You're designing them like a real architect." For the first time that evening, Felix beamed with pure, unfiltered joy. Someone finally understood that his passion wasn't just playing. It was creating. "I want to build real cities someday," he signed. "Places where everyone can live happily. Where kids like me have parks designed specially for them, with visual signals instead of just sound signals." The depth of his vision took Layla's breath away. Felix wasn't just building miniature cities. He was reimagining how communities could work better for everyone. His deafness hadn't limited his dreams. It had expanded them. "I'm designing a school too," he continued, flipping to another page. "With classrooms that have perfect lighting and visual displays. So deaf kids never miss anything important. From across the room, Jason had been watching this exchange with growing confusion. He couldn't understand the sign language, but he could see his son's animated expressions, the way he kept pulling out papers and drawings. When Felix held up the sketchbook, Jason caught a glimpse of the detailed drawings from 30 feet away. Even from that distance, he could see they weren't typical children's artwork. Jason started walking toward them again, this time with curiosity instead of irritation. What exactly was his son showing this photographer? And why did Felix look more engaged than Jason had ever seen him? As he got closer, he began to overhear fragments of what Felix was signing, something about bridges and weight distribution and signal systems. Technical terms that seemed far too advanced for a 7-year-old. What kind of secrets had been hiding in his son's bedroom all this time? The whispers started slowly, then spread like wildfire through the ballroom. Is that the Carrington boy? The one who doesn't speak? Look at him with that photographer. How unusual. I didn't even know he could interact like that. Jason must be mortified. His son making a scene at his own charity gala. The comments weren't meant to be cruel, but they cut deep anyway. Layla could see guests turning to stare, their champagne glasses paused halfway to their lips, as they watched Felix explain his city blueprints with passionate hand movements. To them, he was a curiosity, a sideshow at their exclusive event. To Felix, their stares meant something different. For the first time in his life, people were actually looking at him. Not through him, not around him, but directly at him. The attention was both thrilling and terrifying. People are watching us, he signed to Layla, his hands suddenly less confident. Let them watch, she signed back firmly. You're sharing something amazing. That's worth watching. But Jason could feel the weight of every whispered conversation, every pointed glance. These weren't just random party guests. These were investors, board members, social influencers. People whose opinions could affect his business deals and social standing. Margaret Rothschild, wife of a major hotel chain owner, approached with a concerned expression. Jason, dear, is everything all right? Your son seems quite animated tonight. The pause before animated said everything. In Margaret's world, children should be seen, but not heard. And Felix was being neither seen nor heard in the traditional sense. He was being something else entirely. Something that made the wealthy uncomfortable. Felix is fine, Jason replied tersely, but his eyes kept darting to his son. Of course he is, Margaret continued with fake sweetness. It's just so nice to see him participating. Though I do hope he's not disturbing the photographer from her work duties. Another guest joined the conversation. I was just telling my wife how wonderful it is that you're so patient with his condition. Not every parent would handle it with such grace. Condition. As if Felix's deafness was a disease to be managed rather than simply a different way of experiencing the world. Jason's jaw clenched. He'd heard variations of these comments for years, but tonight they felt different. More insulting. Maybe because for the first time he was seeing Felix not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with ideas worth hearing. The question burning in his mind was no longer whether Felix should stop his conversation with the photographer. It was whether these people deserved to be in the same room as his brilliant son. Would he finally stand up for Felix, or would he let social pressure force his son back into invisible silence? The answer would determine not just how this evening ended, but what kind of father he chose to be from this moment forward. The whispers were getting louder. Felix was getting quieter, and Jason was about to make the most important decision of his life. Layla gently guided Felix toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the growing crowd of whispers and stares. They found a spot behind a massive marble pillar where the noise felt distant and the judgment couldn't reach them. "Are you okay?" she signed, noticing how Felix's excitement had dimmed since the guests started talking. Felix looked down at his polished shoes, then back up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for a 7-year-old. "I'm used to it," he signed. "People always talk about me like I'm not there." Like I'm broken furniture or something. The casual way he said it broke Layla's heart. This wasn't fresh pain. This was a wound that had been reopening for years. Sometimes I pretend I can hear what they're saying, Felix continued, his small hands moving with practiced resignation. I imagine they're saying nice things about my cities or my airplane models. But I know they're not. What do you think they're really saying? Felix's answer came without hesitation. Poor Jason. Such a tragedy. What a burden. He paused, then added something that made Layla's chest tighten. I know my dad thinks it too, even if he doesn't say it. From 30 feet away, Jason had been trying to rejoin his business conversation, but his eyes kept drifting back to his son. He couldn't understand the sign language, but he could read body language. And what he saw in Felix's posture, the slight slump of his shoulders, the way he kept glancing around nervously, looked like defeat. When had his son learned to expect so little from the world? Do you know what's really sad? Felix signed to Layla. I have everything kids dream about. Video games, toys, a huge bedroom, even a private tutor. But I trade it all just to have one real conversation with my dad. The honesty in that statement hit harder than any business loss Jason had ever faced. Because he was close enough now to see his son's face, and the longing there was unmistakable. Have you ever tried talking to him? Layla asked gently. How? Felix's hands moved with frustration. He doesn't know sign language. And when I try to write things down or draw pictures, he's always too busy with phone calls or meetings. He hired people to talk to me, so he doesn't have to. Each word was a knife to Jason's heart, because it was true. He had hired specialists, tutors, therapists, anyone who could handle what he couldn't. He'd told himself it was because professionals knew better. But the real reason was simpler and more painful. He was afraid. Afraid of failing at the one job that mattered most. Afraid of not being enough for his son. Afraid that learning sign language would mean accepting that Felix would never be the son Jason had imagined. But watching Felix now, seeing the intelligence and creativity and pure heart that had been there all along, Jason realized something that changed everything. Felix had never needed to be fixed. Jason was the one who was broken. I used to think maybe if I got really good at building things or really smart at math, he might notice me, Felix continued. But he never comes to see what I've made. Never asks about my cities or my drawings. The tragedy wasn't Felix's deafness. The tragedy was a father so focused on what his son couldn't do that he'd missed everything his son could do. Jason took a step closer, no longer caring about the business deals or social expectations or whispered conversations. For the first time in 7 years, he was ready to really see his son. My dad wants me to be invisible, Felix signed to Layla, his young hands moving with surprising determination. He brings me to these parties, but I'm supposed to stand quietly and not bother anyone. Like a decoration. Layla watched Jason approaching from across the room, his face unreadable. What if you didn't have to be invisible anymore? She signed back. Felix's eyes widened. What do you mean? What if you showed people who you really are? Not the quiet boy in the corner, but the architect who builds cities and designs bridges. For a moment, Felix looked terrified at the thought. Then something shifted in his expression, a spark of rebellion that surprised them both. I'm tired of pretending I don't exist, he signed firmly. I have ideas. Good ideas. Why should I hide them just because people don't want to learn my language? Jason was close enough now to see the conversation but not understand it. What he could see was the change in his son's posture, straighter, more confident, almost defiant. Felix, Jason said when he reached them, his voice gentler than it had been earlier. I think it's time. But Felix did something he'd never done before. He held up his hand in the universal gesture for stop, then turned to Layla and signed. Tell him I want to show everyone my city blueprints. Tell him I'm not ashamed of who I am anymore. Layla hesitated, caught between father and son. He wants to share his architectural drawings with the guests, she translated carefully. Jason blinked in surprise. Architectural drawings? Dad, Felix signed, knowing his father couldn't understand, but needing to say it anyway. I'm not broken. I'm different. There's a difference. The determination in Felix's movements, the way he stood his ground instead of shrinking back, showed Jason something he'd never seen before. His son had courage. Real courage. The kind that comes from finally deciding you're worth fighting for. He's been designing buildings and city systems, Layla explained to Jason. Complex engineering projects. He's incredibly talented. Jason looked down at the sketchbook, still in Felix's hands, really seeing it for the first time. May I? He asked, reaching for it. Felix paused, then handed it over, not with resignation, but with pride. As Jason flipped through the pages, his business associates gathered around, curious about what could capture their host's complete attention. What they saw made them stop talking entirely. The drawings were extraordinary. Detailed, precise, innovative. The work of someone who understood not just art, but mathematics, engineering, and design. Felix drew these, one of the men asked, his voice full of disbelief. Jason nodded, unable to speak. His son, the child he'd thought needed fixing, had been creating masterpieces in silence. For the first time in Felix's life, his father looked at him with something that wasn't pity or worry or distant affection. Jason looked at him with respect, and Felix, seeing that look, stood even taller. The invisible boy was finally ready to be seen. Watching Felix stand up for himself reminded Layla of something she'd almost forgotten. Her years as a social worker before becoming a photographer. I used to work with kids like you, she signed to Felix during a quiet moment. Not deaf kids specifically, but kids who felt invisible for different reasons. Felix tilted his head, curious. What happened to them? The ones who found their voice? They changed the world. The ones who stayed silent. Layla paused, remembering faces that still haunted her. They disappeared into themselves. She thought about Marcus, a brilliant kid from the projects who invented solar panels from old electronics, but never showed anyone because he thought poor kids weren't supposed to be smart. Or Sophie, who wrote poetry that could make adults cry, but kept it hidden because foster kids weren't supposed to have feelings that deep. The hardest part wasn't their circumstances, Layla continued. It was watching parents and teachers and society tell these amazing kids that their gifts didn't matter because they came in packages nobody expected. Felix absorbed this, then signed something that made Layla's heart ache. Do you think my dad will ever see me the way you do? Before she could answer, Jason appeared beside them again. This time, he wasn't trying to pull Felix away. He was trying to understand. Layla, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. And an explanation. She looked up at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. When Felix was diagnosed, I thought my job was to fix him, make him normal. I spent millions on doctors, specialists, experimental treatments. I was so focused on what he couldn't do that I never bothered to learn what he could do. Jason looked down at his son, who was watching this conversation with growing hope. How does wealth blind even the most loving parents? Jason asked, more to himself than to Layla. I could buy him anything except the one thing he needed most, a father who spoke his language. The honesty in Jason's admission surprised everyone within earshot. This wasn't the confident billionaire they knew from magazine covers. This was just a dad who'd realized he'd been failing at the most important job of his life. It's not too late, Layla said simply. He's 7 years old, and he still believes in you. That won't last forever, but it's still there today. Felix tugged on Layla's dress and signed. What's he saying about me? He's saying he wants to learn, she signed back. Felix's face lit up with cautious hope. He looked at his father and signed something slowly, carefully. A simple message even someone who didn't know sign language might understand. He signed, I love you, Dad. Jason didn't need a translation for that. The meaning was clear in his son's expression, in the gentle movement of his hands, in the hope shining in his dark eyes. For the first time in 7 years, Jason signed back. Not words, He didn't know any yet. But he tapped his chest, pointed to Felix, and nodded. It was a start. I have an idea, Felix signed to Layla, his excitement building as he glanced around the ballroom. What if we showed some of these people my cities? Not everyone, just the ones who seem nice. Layla followed his gaze. Which one seemed nice? Felix pointed discreetly to a woman in a blue dress who'd smiled at him earlier, then to an older gentleman who'd nodded politely when they'd walked by. They looked at me like I was a person, not a problem. The plan was innocent enough, a child wanting to share his passion project with friendly adults. But Layla could see the deeper significance. Felix wasn't just wanting to show off his work. He was testing whether the world was ready to see him as more than Jason Carrington's disabled son. We could set up a small display, Felix continued, his hands moving rapidly with enthusiasm. Just one or two of my building models and some blueprints. Like a mini exhibition. From across the room, Jason had been watching this animated conversation with growing curiosity. He couldn't understand the signs, but he could see his son's face lighting up with a kind of joy he'd never witnessed before. He started walking toward them, catching fragments of their discussion. Words like display and exhibition and blueprints drifted over, making him wonder what exactly they were planning. Felix, Jason said as he approached, what are you two discussing? Felix looked up at his father, then at Layla, uncertainty flickering across his face. This was the moment. Would he retreat back into silence, or would he take the biggest risk of his young life? He chose courage. Felix pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, typing quickly. I want to show people my city models. Layla thinks some guests might be interested in my architecture work. Jason read the message twice, processing not just the words, but what they represented. His son was asking for something he'd never requested before recognition. Not sympathy, not accommodation, but genuine acknowledgement of his abilities. You want to display your work? Here? Tonight. Felix nodded, then typed another message. I know it's not normal, but I'm tired of being normal. Normal for me means invisible. The clarity of that statement hit Jason like a physical blow. His son had been analyzing his own situation, drawing conclusions, making decisions about his worth and his place in the world. And Jason had been completely unaware of any of it. What would you need? Jason asked quietly. Felix's eyes widened in shock. He'd expected rejection, not support. Layla stepped in. Just a small table, maybe some good lighting. Felix has incredibly detailed models and blueprints that would speak for themselves. Jason looked around the ballroom, his ballroom filled with his guests at his charity event. For 7 years, he'd kept Felix on the sidelines of his world. Tonight, for the first time, his son was asking to step into the center of it. The question was no longer whether Felix was ready to be seen. The question was whether Jason was ready to let the world discover what an extraordinary son he'd been hiding. 20 minutes later, a small crowd had gathered around an elegant side table that Jason had personally cleared and repositioned. Felix stood beside it, his hands trembling slightly as he unwrapped his most prized creation, a miniature downtown district complete with working streetlights and tiny moving elevators. The transformation was immediate and stunning. My God, whispered Dr. Patricia Valdez, a renowned architect who'd been invited to the gala. The proportions are mathematically perfect. How did you calculate the structural support for this bridge design? Felix looked to Layla, who interpreted the question in sign language. His response, translated back, made the small audience gasp. I studied real bridge collapses online and figured out what went wrong, then designed this one to avoid those problems. He was 7 years old, discussing structural engineering failures like a graduate student. Margaret Rothschild, the same woman who'd whispered about Felix being a burden earlier, now leaned in closer with genuine fascination. Felix, dear, is this entire city based on a real place? Through Layla's interpretation, Felix explained, it's what I think New York could look like if architects designed buildings for all kinds of people. See these ramps? And these light signals, instead of just sound signals? Every building would be accessible to everyone. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was awestruck. Dr. Valdez pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. This is revolutionary urban planning. You've solved accessibility problems that city planners struggle with for years. Felix's face glowed with pride, but his eyes kept searching the crowd for one specific person. His father stood at the edge of the group, watching with an expression that was impossible to read. The electrical work alone, murmured another guest, a tech executive whose company designed smart city systems. How did you wire these streetlights to work independently? Felix's explanation, filtered through Layla's interpretation, revealed that he taught himself basic electronics by watching YouTube videos and experimenting with old phone chargers and LED strips. He'd been running his own engineering laboratory in his bedroom for 2 years, and nobody knew. Felix, Dr. Valdez said, crouching down to his eye level, has anyone from your school's gifted program seen this work? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Felix looked at his father, then back at Layla. I don't go to regular school, he signed. I have tutors at home, but they don't know about my cities either. They think I'm just playing with toys. The crowd exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Here was a child with the mind of an engineer, the creativity of an artist, and the vision of a city planner, and he'd been hidden away like a family secret. This isn't playing, Dr. Valdez said firmly, looking directly at Jason. This is genius-level spatial reasoning and problem-solving. Felix should be in advanced STEM programs, not isolated at home. For the first time all evening, Jason felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, not judging Felix, but questioning his choices as a father. These weren't whispers of pity anymore. These were looks of disbelief that such extraordinary talent had been kept hidden. The question burning in everyone's mind was the same one haunting Jason. How many other brilliant children were being overlooked simply because they didn't fit the standard mold? Would Jason finally recognize that his son didn't need to be fixed? The system that had failed to see Felix's potential was what needed fixing? Jason stepped forward, his jaw tight with conflicting emotions. The praise surrounding Felix was everything he'd secretly wanted for his son, but it came with an uncomfortable truth. Strangers had recognized his child's gifts in minutes, while Jason had missed them for years. I think that's enough for tonight, he said firmly, reaching for Felix's model city. The guests stepped back, sensing tension. But Felix surprised everyone by gently blocking his father's hand and signing rapidly to Layla. He says he's not finished showing people his work, Layla interpreted, her voice carefully neutral. Jason's face flushed. Being defied by his son in private was one thing, but in front of influential guests? Felix, we discussed this. It's time to put the toys away. They're not toys. The words came from Dr. Valdez, not Layla. Mr. Carrington, your son has created sophisticated urban planning models that would impress graduate students at MIT. The direct challenge to his authority made Jason's voice harder. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but Felix needs structure. Routine. He can't just. Felix tugged on Layla's dress, his hands moving with urgent determination. What's he saying? Jason demanded. Layla hesitated, then spoke quietly. He's asking me to tell you that he's not broken, that he doesn't need to be managed like a problem that might embarrass you. The words hit Jason like a slap. In front of a dozen of New York's most influential people, his 7-year-old son was calling out his failures as a father. I never said you were broken, Jason replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Felix signed again, more emphatically. He says you never said it out loud, but you've been treating him like he was broken for 3 years, Layla translated reluctantly. The truth of it hung in the air, undeniable. Jason's throat tightened as he looked at his son, really looked at him. Felix wasn't cowering or apologizing or retreating into silence. He was standing his ground, demanding to be seen for who he truly was. Felix, Jason started, then stopped. What could he say that wouldn't sound like more excuses? Layla crouched down to Felix's level and signed something that made his eyes widen. Then she stood and looked directly at Jason. "What did you tell him?" Jason asked. "I told him this was his choice, that he's old enough to decide whether he wants to show his work or hide it. That nobody, not even parents, has the right to make someone invisible." The challenge was clear, and it wasn't just coming from a hired photographer. It was coming from his own son, who'd found his voice through someone else's hands and was using it to demand basic respect. Jason looked around at the faces watching this family drama unfold. Some showed pity, others judgment. But in Felix's eyes, he saw something that cut deeper than any business loss: disappointment. His son was disappointed in him. And for the first time, Jason understood why. The question now was whether he'd choose his ego or his child. Felix made the choice for both of them. Without waiting for his father's permission, he turned back to his miniature city and pointed to a small detail that had escaped everyone's notice: a tiny playground with equipment designed specifically for children with different abilities. "This swing set," he signed to Layla, "has special harnesses for kids who can't balance normally. And these climbing structures have multiple ways to reach the top, so kids in wheelchairs or kids who are scared of heights can still play." Dr. Valdez leaned in closer, her phone camera capturing every detail. "Felix, this is incredible. You've designed inclusive play equipment that most professionals never think to include." "And look at this," Felix continued, growing more confident with each compliment. He pointed to the miniature school building. "The cafeteria has tables at different heights, and every classroom has both audio speakers and visual display boards, so no kid gets left out of lessons." The tech executive who'd admired the electrical work earlier was now taking notes in his phone. "Felix, have you ever thought about becoming an urban planner?" Through Layla's translation, Felix's response made several people smile. "I thought I already was one." Even some of the guests who'd been whispering about him earlier were now gathered around, asking genuine questions about his design choices and engineering solutions. Felix answered each one through Layla, his confidence growing with every exchange. But the moment that changed everything came when a little girl, maybe 5 years old, tugged on her mother's dress and pointed at Felix's city. "Mama, that playground looks fun. Can we build one like that at our house?" Felix's face lit up as he knelt down to the girl's level and showed her the tiny swings and slides, explaining through gestures how each piece was designed to be safe and fun for everyone. From the back of the small crowd, Jason watched his son interact with the little girl, patient, kind, brilliant in his explanations, even without spoken words. For the first time in 7 years, Jason saw Felix not as a child who needed help, but as a teacher sharing knowledge with someone younger. The moment was so pure, so natural, that Jason found himself clapping softly. Just a few gentle claps, but in that ballroom, they sounded like thunder. Felix heard the sound and turned around, searching until he found his father's face in the crowd. When their eyes met, Jason nodded, not the distant nod of polite approval, but the real nod of a father who was genuinely proud. Felix's smile could have powered his miniature streetlights. You know what's beautiful about moments like this? They remind us that every person has something extraordinary inside them. We just have to take the time to look. Felix spent years being invisible, but tonight, people finally saw his brilliance. Don't miss what happens next in this incredible journey. Subscribe now, because stories like this prove that the most amazing discoveries happen when we stop looking past each other and start really seeing who's been there all along. But Felix's biggest challenge was still ahead. Word spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Within 30 minutes, Felix's small display had become the unofficial centerpiece of the entire gala. Guests abandoned their champagne conversations and business networking to crowd around a 7-year-old's architectural masterpiece. "Have you seen the Carrington boys' work?" became the phrase echoing through every corner of the room. Dr. Valdez had called 2 colleagues who lived nearby, inviting them to see Felix's designs in person. The tech executive was already discussing scholarship opportunities for gifted children with disabilities. Margaret Rothschild, who'd questioned Jason's parenting earlier, was now asking if Felix would consider designing a playground for her grandchildren's school. But the most powerful change wasn't in what the guests were saying. It was in how they were looking at Felix. No longer the invisible child to be pitied or ignored. Felix had become someone worth knowing. Adults who'd stepped over his dropped airplane hours earlier were now asking for his autograph on cocktail napkins, treating him like the young architect he'd always been. "This is what happens," Layla murmured to Jason as they watched Felix explain his bridge design to a group of fascinated engineers, "when the world finally sees what was there all along." Jason nodded, but his expression was complex. Pride mixed with regret, joy shadowed by years of lost opportunities. "I had the greatest young mind in Manhattan living in my house," he said quietly, "and I was too busy looking for what was wrong with him to see what was brilliant about him." A woman approached, Dr. Rosa Chun, director of the city's most prestigious program for gifted children. "Mr. Carrington, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I had to meet Felix personally." She knelt down to Felix's eye level and began signing. Fluent, natural sign language that made Felix's eyes light up with surprise and delight. "You know sign language?" Jason asked, amazed. "My daughter is deaf," Dr. Chun replied, still signing with Felix. "She's also a junior architect at 14. Felix reminds me so much of her at his age, brilliant, creative, and hungry for challenges that match his abilities." Felix signed something that made Dr. Chun laugh and nod enthusiastically. "He wants to know if there are other kids like him," she translated. "Other children who build and design and dream in ways that most people don't understand." "Tell him there are hundreds of us," Dr. Chun signed directly to Felix, then looked up at Jason. "And tell him he never has to be invisible again." The transformation in the room was complete. Felix hadn't just shown his work. He'd changed how an entire community of influential people thought about potential, about different kinds of intelligence, about what it means to truly see another person. But perhaps the most important person whose mind had changed was standing right beside him. Jason Carrington, billionaire businessman who'd spent years trying to fix his son, was finally ready to learn from him instead. What happens when the world finally sees what was there all along? Everything changes. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, everyone gets a second chance to do better, including fathers who'd forgotten how to see their sons. The moment that changed everything happened at 10:47 p.m. Jason had been watching from the sidelines as his son fielded questions from some of the brightest minds in New York City. Felix was in his element, confident, articulate through Layla's interpretation, and brilliant in ways Jason was only beginning to understand. But then something shifted. The crowd around Felix's display had grown so large that Layla was struggling to keep up with all the questions being fired at once. Felix looked overwhelmed, his hands moving frantically as he tried to respond to multiple people simultaneously. That's when Jason made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He walked through the crowd, gently placed his hand on Felix's shoulder, and did something he'd never done in public before. He signed. It wasn't fluent. It wasn't perfect. But it was unmistakably sign language. "My son," he signed slowly, deliberately, making sure Felix could see every movement, "is brilliant." The ballroom fell silent. Felix's eyes went wide, then filled with tears. His father, the man who'd spent years avoiding his language, his world, his way of communicating, was signing. Publicly, in front of hundreds of people. "I am proud of you," Jason continued, his movements careful but sincere. "I am sorry it took me so long to learn your words." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Dr. Chun started clapping. Dr. Valdez joined her. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in applause, not polite charity gala clapping, but genuine, emotional appreciation for what they'd just witnessed. A father learning his child's language. A billionaire admitting he'd been wrong. A family finding each other in front of 300 strangers. But Jason wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and, hands shaking slightly, typed a message that he held up for everyone to see. Tonight my son taught me that accessibility isn't about fixing people. It's about fixing systems that exclude them. The crowd murmured in appreciation, but Jason kept typing. Effective Monday, Carrington Industries will launch a $50 million initiative to make every one of our buildings, websites, and services fully accessible to people with disabilities. We're also establishing a scholarship fund for young innovators, like Felix, who see solutions where others see problems. The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. This wasn't just a proud father moment. This was a major corporation publicly committing to systemic change because a 7-year-old had opened his father's eyes. Felix looked up at his dad with pure wonder, then signed something that made Jason's chest tighten with emotion. What did he say? Dr. Chen asked softly. Jason's voice cracked slightly as he answered. He said, "Thank you for finally seeing me." Margaret Rothschild, who'd questioned Felix's presence hours earlier, was now wiping tears from her eyes. The tech executive was already texting colleagues about partnering on the Accessibility Initiative. Dr. Valdez was discussing internship programs for gifted children with disabilities. Felix had done more than showcase his architectural talents. He'd sparked movement. But the most powerful moment came when Felix walked to the microphone stand. Someone had lowered it to his height and gestured for Layla to translate one final message. "Felix wants everyone to know," Layla announced, her voice carrying across the now completely silent ballroom, "that he's not the only kid like this. There are others, kids who are brilliant but invisible, talented but overlooked, innovative but ignored. He hopes tonight helps people remember to look for the extraordinary in places they might not expect to find it." The 7-year-old who'd started the evening as invisible furniture had ended it as the voice for an entire community of overlooked children. And his father, the man who'd built an empire but nearly lost a son, was finally ready to build bridges instead of walls. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the cleanup crew was packing away Felix's miniature city, Layla found herself sitting on the marble steps outside the ballroom with a boy who'd changed everything. Felix was still in his tiny tuxedo, but his bow tie was undone and his hair was messed up from all the people who'd ruffled it in affection throughout the evening. He looked exhausted, but happy, the kind of happy that comes from finally being seen for who you really are. "How do you feel?" Layla signed to him. Felix thought for a long moment, then signed back, "Like I exist." Those 3 words hit harder than any of the elaborate compliments he'd received from architects and engineers all night. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to discover what it feels like to exist. But Felix had spent so many years invisible that tonight felt like being born all over again. "You always existed," Layla signed gently. "People just weren't looking hard enough." "Were you scared?" Felix asked. "When you first talked to me, tonight." Layla considered the question honestly. "A little. Not scared of you, scared of getting involved in something that wasn't my business." "I'm glad you got involved." "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the tall windows. Felix pulled out his sketchbook and started drawing something new. Not a building or a bridge this time, but people. Lots of people, all different shapes and sizes, all with their hands raised in different signs. "What's that?" Layla asked. "My next project," Felix signed with growing excitement. "A communication garden. A place where people who speak different languages, sign language, spoken languages, even art and music, can all understand each other." Even after the most emotionally draining night of his young life, Felix was already dreaming of ways to help other people feel less alone. The empathy in this child was extraordinary. "You know what I learned tonight?" Layla signed to him. Felix looked up from his drawing, curious. One small gesture can break a lifetime of invisibility. When I first signed hello to you, I had no idea it would change both our lives. Felix nodded thoughtfully, then signed something that made Layla's heart swell. Maybe that's how all the best changes happen. One person decides to see someone else differently. From the ballroom doorway, Jason appeared. He'd been watching them for several minutes, trying to process everything that had happened. In one evening, his understanding of his son, his responsibilities as a father, and his role in the world had been completely transformed. He approached slowly and sat down on the step beside Felix. For the first time in years, the three of them, father, son, and the photographer who'd brought them together, sat in peaceful quiet. Felix reached for his father's hand and squeezed it gently. Jason squeezed back, and in that simple gesture was 7 years of missed opportunities, infinite possibilities for the future, and the beginning of a relationship built on acceptance instead of expectations. Sometimes the most profound changes start with the smallest acts of courage. A photographer decides to sign hello. A boy chooses to share his dreams. A father learns to speak his child's language. Tonight, everyone learned what happens when we stop trying to fix each other and start trying to understand each other instead. 3 months later, the changes were everywhere. Jason's calendar now included something it had never contained before: daily sign language lessons with Dr. Chen's recommended instructor. Not just basic phrases, but conversational sign language that would let him really talk with Felix about dreams, fears, jokes, and all the ordinary father-son things they'd missed for 7 years. The transformation in their relationship was remarkable. Where once Jason had hired specialists to handle Felix's needs, now he was directly involved in every aspect of his son's world. They designed buildings together, discussed urban planning over breakfast, and spent evenings working on Felix's ever-expanding miniature city. But the biggest surprise was how much Jason was learning from his son. Felix had started joining his father for selected business meetings, not as decoration or inspiration, but as a junior consultant. The boy's unique perspective on accessibility and inclusive design was revolutionizing how Carrington Industries approached every project. Traditional architects think about making buildings pretty. Felix had signed to a room full of contractors and designers. I think about making buildings work for everyone. His insights were so valuable that Jason had started bringing Felix to planning sessions for the new accessibility initiative. The 7-year-old was helping design office spaces, public areas, and digital interfaces that would serve people with all kinds of disabilities. Felix's confidence had grown exponentially. No longer the quiet child who hid in corners, he now approached new people with curiosity instead of fear. At the grocery store, he'd wave at other kids. At restaurants, he'd sign thank you to servers, teaching them new words in the process. The house staff noticed the changes too. Felix had started leaving his bedroom door open, inviting people to see his architectural projects instead of hiding them. The models that once lived in secret now filled a dedicated room where Felix could work on them with proper lighting and tools. But perhaps the most touching change was in the small moments. Jason had started leaving notes for Felix, not instructions or reminders, but actual messages. Saw your new bridge design. The engineering is brilliant. Love, Dad. Felix would respond with his own notes, usually accompanied by small sketches or building plans. Their breakfast table had become a workspace where they'd spread out blueprints and discuss improvements to Felix's cities. Jason would point out structural challenges. Felix would propose creative solutions that often worked better than traditional approaches. You know what I realized? Jason said one morning as they worked together on a new playground design for kids with mobility challenges. Felix looked up from his detailed measurements, curious. I spent years trying to teach you about my world, Jason continued, practicing his sign language as he spoke. But you've taught me more about seeing the world differently than any business school ever did. Felix grinned and signed back, Maybe that's what families are supposed to do, teach each other new ways to see things. The father who'd once seen his son as broken was now learning that Felix had never needed fixing. Jason was the one who'd needed to change his perspective, and that change was creating ripples far beyond their family. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, Riverside Elementary School's annual innovation fair. Felix had been attending their inclusion program for gifted children with disabilities for 2 months, and this would be his first public presentation to peers, parents, and teachers. Jason's hands shook as he read the letter, not from fear that Felix would fail, but from excitement about watching his son shine in front of people his own age. The project Felix had chosen was ambitious, a complete redesign of the school playground to make it accessible and fun for children with different physical abilities, learning styles, and sensory needs. On presentation day, Jason sat in the back of the school auditorium, watching Felix set up his display with the confidence of someone who'd found his calling. The miniature playground model was his most sophisticated work yet, every swing, slide, and climbing structure designed with multiple ways to play and explore. When Felix's turn came, he walked to the front of the room with his shoulders straight and his head high. Dr. Chin stood beside him to interpret, but Felix had insisted on presenting primarily through his visual models and written explanations. Most playgrounds are built for kids who can run, climb, and hear instructions, Felix's presentation board read. But what about kids who use wheelchairs? Or kids who get scared of loud noises? Or kids who think differently? He unveiled his model playground section by section, explaining how each area served different needs while keeping all the children playing together. Ramps alongside stairs. Quiet zones next to active areas. Visual signals paired with audio ones. The coolest part, Felix had written on his final display board, is that when you design for everyone, you make everything better for everyone. The audience was captivated. Parents pulled out phones to record. Teachers took notes. But most importantly, the other kids in Felix's class started asking questions. Real questions from genuine curiosity, not the pitying or awkward questions he'd faced before. "Felix, could you build this at our school?" asked a girl named Sophia who used a wheelchair. "Would there be swings that I could use too?" wondered a boy named Marcus who had cerebral palsy. "Can you teach us how to build stuff like this?" came from several kids at once. For the first time in his life, Felix wasn't the kid who needed special accommodations. He was the kid with solutions that could help everyone. When the presentation ended, the applause was enthusiastic and genuine. But the moment that mattered most to Felix came when his classmates surrounded his display, asking if they could help him build a real version of his playground. Jason watched from the back row as his son became the center of positive attention, teaching other children about inclusive design and accessibility in ways that felt natural and fun rather than forced or clinical. When recognition comes, it changes everything. Felix had gone from invisible to invaluable, from overlooked to essential, from someone who needed help to someone who could help others. And in that school auditorium, surrounded by peers who saw him as brilliant rather than broken, Felix finally found what every child deserves: a place where he belonged exactly as he was. The weeks after the school innovation fair felt different, not just for Felix, but for everyone around him. Layla noticed it first. Whenever she visited the Carrington estate, Felix no longer hovered silently in the background. He wanted to be part of the conversation. He wanted to be heard. And more importantly, he wanted to learn how to share his ideas with confidence. So, on Saturday afternoons, Layla started something new: speech practice. Not speeches in the traditional sense, but storytelling sessions where Felix learned to present his ideas clearly, whether through sign, written words, or a combination of both. "Imagine you're explaining to a whole room of kids your age," Layla told him one afternoon, camera in hand as she filmed practice runs. "Don't just show the model, tell them why it matters." Felix signed nervously at first, stumbling over his words when Layla interpreted. But she was patient, teaching him to pause, to breathe, to let the audience catch up with his ideas. Within a few weeks, he was not only explaining his miniature cities, he was drawing people in with his passion. Jason watched all of this with awe. For years, he had believed structure and control would unlock his son's potential. But it turned out that freedom, encouragement, and a little guidance were what Felix needed most. Meanwhile, Jason was undergoing a transformation of his own. Carrington Industries had begun rolling out its accessibility initiative. Office towers were being retrofitted with ramps and sensory-friendly workspaces. Websites were redesigned with inclusive features. A scholarship program launched for young inventors who thought differently. And the credit for all of it? Jason made sure everyone knew. This was my son's idea, he told every board member, every journalist, every business partner. Felix showed me what accessibility really means. But perhaps the biggest twist came from outside their family. The gala that had once been filled with whispers of pity was now the center of a quiet revolution. Families who had once hidden their different children began reaching out, asking how Felix had been discovered, how Jason had changed, how they could learn to see their own kids in a new light. One mother confided at a charity luncheon, "For years, I thought my son's silence meant he had nothing to say. Now I wonder if I just wasn't listening." Another father admitted, "I hired tutors and therapists, but I never asked my daughter what she wanted to build. Maybe I've been looking in the wrong direction." It wasn't just Felix's models that were changing the city. It was his story, his courage, his refusal to stay invisible. By late spring, the Carrington home was filled with blueprints and Lego bricks, visiting architects, and, surprisingly, laughter. Jason no longer kept Felix tucked away. Instead, he introduced him proudly to guests as the real genius of the family. Layla noticed the shift most clearly one evening when Felix practiced his speech about communication gardens. Jason sat beside him, not correcting, not controlling, just listening. And when Felix finished, Jason signed one simple phrase back: "You inspire me." The boy who once believed he was invisible was now teaching an entire generation how to see. And the ripple effects? They were only just beginning. The invitation surprised no one this time. 3 months after the school fair, Felix was asked to return to the very place where his story had first changed everything, the Carrington Foundation Gala. Only now, the circumstances were completely different. The boy who had once stood silently in a corner was coming back not as an afterthought, but as the evening's featured guest. His name was on the program. His work had its own showcase. People weren't whispering about him anymore. They were waiting for him. When Felix entered the ballroom, wearing a crisp navy suit and carrying a portfolio of new designs, the energy shifted instantly. Instead of sidelong glances, he was greeted with warm waves and genuine smiles. Guests leaned down to shake his hand. Some even greeted him in sign language, less than perfect, but sincere attempts inspired by his story. Jason hovered proudly nearby, no longer protective in the wrong ways, but supportive in the right ones. He had learned his role wasn't to shield Felix from the world, but to stand beside him while Felix stepped into it. Layla was there too, camera slung over her shoulder, her eyes shining with quiet pride. She remembered the boy who once felt invisible, tugging at her sleeve to ask if it was safe to be seen. Tonight, that same boy walked straight to the stage without hesitation. When it was time for Felix to present, the ballroom fell into expectant silence. Layla stood at his side to interpret, but she noticed something remarkable. Felix didn't look to her for confidence anymore. He looked to the audience, steady and calm, as if he belonged there. "This," Felix signed, pointing to a new model on display, "is what I call a shared city." Layla's voice carried his words clearly. "It's a design where no one has to ask for special permission to exist. Every park, every building, every street works for everyone." He explained ramps disguised as elegant pathways, sound signals paired with glowing visual cues, and classrooms built with multiple forms of communication, so no student ever felt left behind. The boy who once spoke only through models was now telling a story that everyone could understand. The crowd didn't just listen, they leaned in. Dr. Valdez scribbled notes furiously. Dr. Chun smiled knowingly. Parents of children with disabilities nodded with tears in their eyes. Even business tycoons whispered among themselves about how to bring Felix's ideas into reality.